Louisiana is experiencing a fiscal crisis that approaches $1.6 billion. The following slides attempt to demonstrate three issues with our budget problem. 1. The deficit is significant. The $1.6 billion represents approximately 19% of the state's general fund revenues. 2. The legislature has a small amount of discretionary funding to solve the problem. And 3. The state gives away a significant amount of revenues through tax expenditures. The state budget is in a deficit posture because the estimated expenditures for next year are $10.1 billion, while the projected revenues to pay for these expenditures are $8.5 billion. This imbalance equals $1.6 billion. This shortfall is the result of three major items. Approximately $1 billion of non-recurring revenues from items such as fund balances and lawsuit settlements were used to balance the current budget. However, these revenues will not be available next year to fund recurring government expenditures. Another contributing factor is the $300 million in normal or continuation budget growth. This is the increase in the budget that it would take next year to continue to perform the same government services that are being provided in the current year. A $300 million decrease in the state general fund revenues, largely due to the decline of mineral revenues, has exacerbated the problem. The forecasted price of oil has dropped from $95 per barrel to $60 per barrel, causing a steep decline in the state's mineral revenues. It's reasonable to ask, why is it so difficult to solve a $1.6 billion problem in a $26 billion budget? Well, the amount of money that the legislature can actually affect is much smaller than the total budget. The total state budget is approximately $26 billion, but about $23 billion is not available to solve for the state general fund budget problems because it is either required by federal or state law or required for debt service or other unavoidable obligations. The remaining $3 billion is the discretionary funding that the legislature can affect. Of this amount, almost $2.4 billion is spent on health care and education, which the public has said is a high spending priority. That leaves $554 million of discretionary funds, the dark green slice, that are spent on other items such as prisons, museums, elections, veterans, etc. That makes it difficult to solve a $1.6 billion budget problem with $554 million in discretionary dollars. There have been many reductions to the limited amount of discretionary state expenditures over the last few years as the legislature worked to address the deficit. These reductions include significant cuts to higher education, prison closures, hospital privatization, closure of medical facilities, and reduction of the state workforce, among others. Here you can see the change in state general fund expenditures from fiscal year 2009 to fiscal year 2014. The total state general fund expenditures have decreased by $847 million over these 6 years, and higher education has been cut by $1.147 billion, which amounts to a 68% reduction. In contrast, look at the tax exemptions by category for the same 6-year period. You can see that the total tax exemptions increased by $1.3 billion, which is a 32% increase over the same period of time that the state expenditures were reduced by $847 million. Every year, the Louisiana Department of Revenue is required by law to publish a tax exemption budget. This report shows collections and exemptions for each category of tax. The collections are represented by the solid bars and the exemptions by the dotted bars. You can see the enormous disparity between the amount of revenues collected from corporations at $467 million versus the amount of exemptions for corporations at $1.9 billion. Also, You can see in the far right column that the total actual collections are $7.487 billion, while the total estimated exemptions are $7.618 billion, which means the state exempts more from taxation than it collects. Here you can see the Legislative Fiscal Office estimates of what legislation affecting taxes has amounted to since 2008. You will notice that the total is almost $2.2 billion in losses to the state's revenues. This estimated loss to the state's revenues was not due to the economy, but due to the passage of new laws granting additional tax exemptions, deductions, exclusions, credits, rebates, etc. Over half of this estimated revenue loss was due to the partial reversal of the Stelly Plan in 2008, which affected individual income rates, brackets, and excess federal itemized personal deductions. In summary, the $1.6 billion budget shortfall is unlike any the state has faced in decades. Louisiana's colleges and universities face an 82% cut to their state funding, which would likely lead to the closure of many of our institutions. Given the current structure of the budget, that leaves $554 million in discretionary state expenditures. After excluding education and healthcare, it is impossible to solve the $1.6 billion shortfall with budget cuts alone. Over the last few years, while state expenditures for departments were being downsized, numerous laws were enacted to exempt or expend billions of dollars of revenues through tax expenditures. As part of the 2015 regular session of the legislature, legislators are meeting to develop long-term solutions to address the issues that have created this structural budget deficit.